Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the very last discussion in our 2-week spotlight on solitary that we've held over the last, over the last 2 weeks, since the 16th of November. And today we are in discussion with the 4 organizations who were really key in bringing all of this together, but we were not alone. We were certainly joined by many other experts in this field and so many people who contributed their thoughts, their expertise, and their time to bringing a spotlight to the fact that solitary confinement continues in Canada. Although, we had some legislation that was brought in over a year ago, almost a year ago now, which was supposed to replace segregation with what we now know as the structured intervention units. And although the structured intervention units were supposed to do away with segregation, we have seen over the last year that solitary continues in the structured intervention units and in other ways as well. And so we really wanted to bring that to the forefront in our discussion over the last 2 weeks. And the reason behind that is because we would like that to change. We think that, solitary confinement is a symptom of a larger problem in our society. And it's something that we need to not only change within the prisons, but change outside in society as well. And so I'm joined today by 3 wonderful human beings who have been so integral in this last 2 weeks. We have Adelina Iftene from the Schulich School of Law. We have Jen Metcalfe from Prisoners Legal Services, and we have Catherine Latimer from the John Howard Society of Canada. And we're very lucky here at the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies to be able to partner with all 3 of them and so many others. And so today we're going to have our last thoughts and hopefully not our last thoughts certainly on this forever, but our last thoughts on this for the last 2 weeks and some calls to action. And I'm going to begin with Adelina Iftene from the Schulich School of Law, and then we're going to move to Jen and then to Catherine. So Adelina, I'll leave it to you to start us off with what are some of your thoughts as we've gone through these last 2 weeks.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for being part of this discussion for the last 2 weeks. I know we had an impressive number of people getting involved and watching the videos, asking questions, tweeting, Facebooking. It was an impressive statement on what people think about solitary confinement and on the state of corrections currently. So I'm very grateful to have been part of that. Now, in 1996, Louise Arbour released her report on the inquiry into the events that took place in Kingston at the prison for women back in 1994. And she was appointed to investigate these events following reports of significant mistreatment of incarcerated women, including extensive periods of isolation, use of force, mistreatment of women with mental illnesses, and much more. Now, that was 25 years ago. What we have heard over the last 2 weeks shows that as a country, we have an utter inability to learn from past mistakes, and that the government and the Correctional Service Canada continue to operate outside of the rule of law. As many of our speakers said during these 2 weeks, none of this is news to those who have been working in prison law for decades. We have heard this before again and again. In my interview with Tony Dube, I reacted to a comment he made about how CSC treated him by saying, wow, that's unbelievable. And someone in the audience wrote back in the chat, it's not unbelievable. And I think that summarizes where we are now. More or less, we are where we were 25 years ago, and that is not unbelievable to anyone. We heard over these 2 weeks about the lack of transparency and accountability of prison systems, about how solitary confinement remains alive and well, despite the changing of its name last year, despite the charter cases that found various forms of isolation unconstitutional, despite the large amount of scholarship, reports, and litigation that were produced over the last 25 years. We heard that women continue to be placed in humiliating conditions in dry cells. We heard how solitary confinement has been medicalized and people are isolated under the pretext that they are being treated. We heard how Indigenous and Black, people with mental illnesses, the elderly, and those with disabilities are overrepresented in various forms of isolation. We heard how CSC is not able to implement even the meager requirements that allegedly make SIUs not solitary confinement, like 4 hours out of cell and 2 hours of meaningful contact. We heard how they deceived the independent board the government itself put in place to oversee the implementation of the SIUs. We heard how the most common response to COVID was to lock people up, in stark contradiction to the urges of various international bodies and the OCI. L. Jones notes during this week that those who ask for abolition are often told that they don't understand how bad those incarcerated people are and how prison operates. And she said that, in fact, the asks for abolition come from a place of knowing that reform does not lead anywhere, a place of knowing that we've been here before, time after time, incident after incident, litigation after litigation, call to action after call to action. She is right. Just like Justice Arbour was right 25 years ago, when she said that Correctional Service Canada cannot be trusted to implement the rule of law in their own institutions. Change must come from the outside, through courts and through the parliament. The changes that come through courts are important, but they are incremental. So then, now we need to ask for what some may see as radical change, but which in fact has its roots in the 25-year-old recommendations of Louise Arbour. I asked the government and parliament to implement Louise Arbour's recommendations. I asked that the government publicize immediately the reports from Tony Dube and Jane Sprott, as well as the PLS report, and provide immediate response to them. I asked that they recognize that isolation is not a place, it's a practice. Under any name and form, it has devastating consequences on people and on communities. I asked that all these forms of isolation be abolished. They have no place in this country. I asked that a clear date be set for the government to think through alternatives to the use of isolation, at which time these forms of isolation must be discontinued. I asked that in the interim, while the government works towards these alternatives, hard caps be implemented on all forms of isolation, and those hard caps should be well under the 15 days permitted by the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules, the Mandela Rules. I asked that judicial oversight be instituted over any decision related to the isolation under any name of a prisoner. I asked that adequate remedies be provided to those prisoners whose rights have been infringed by prolonged and indefinite placements in various forms of isolation, including, as Justice Arbour long ago suggested, a reduction in their sentence. I asked that the government commit and follow through to the commitment to increase the transparency of the correctional system. Thank you.
Thank you, Adelina. You really summed up the last 2 weeks in powerful ways. And I really appreciate you reading out Elle's quote because, you know, she's right. Everybody who has been here over the last 2 weeks, and in particular, when we look back at that historical panel who've been working on this for decades, you know, they know their expertise comes from a place of knowing. And when Mary Campbell was speaking on that panel, she said, in fact, when solitary was implemented all those many years ago, it was immediately recognized as torture. And so even hundreds of years later, we're still tinkering at the margins and going back and forth as to whether or not this is socially acceptable, whether or not we are infringing on someone's human rights by putting them into solitary confinement. And we know that is an infringement. We know that it is torture. And so I thank you for your powerful asks. Many of them mirror our positions. We certainly ask at CAEFS for judicial oversight of any solitary confinement. Because of the population that we serve, we have focused on the elimination of segregation for women and those with mental illness. And we are also asking for there to be remedies for those who have been placed in unlawful solitary confinement and a reduction in their sentence. So I think, you know, in addition to all of the other ones that you have said, which we certainly support at CAEFS as well. And so I'm going to turn to Jen, who is going to bring us to another discussion around the prisoners' legal services positions, but also to bring some of the comments that Adelina has made into a bit of a larger context as well.
Thanks so much, Emilie and Adelina. It's been a real pleasure, and Catherine, working with you over these last 2 weeks on this campaign and seeing all the other speakers. I agree. The speakers over the last couple of weeks have reinforced the need for dramatic changes to our prison system. Ivan Zinger shared some staggering statistics during his talk. CSC's annual budget is close to $2.5 billion. CSC has many staff working in prisons as there are prisoners, and yet they can't seem to provide everyone at least 2 hours of meaningful human contact each day. And the annual average cost of imprisoning one person is over $120,000. Ivan Zinger also told us that counts are down and there are a significant number of empty beds in Canada's prisons. Let's take this opportunity to get people to lower levels of security and start closing maximum security prisons. Maximum security prisons isolate people, they use violence against them, and they re-traumatize people who have already experienced a lot of trauma in their lives. They do nothing to rehabilitate people or to help them heal. With the money saved by closing maximum security prisons, investment should be made in community-based mental health services and anti-poverty initiatives to help people stay out of prison in the first place. We also know that only about 5.5% of CSC's 18,000 employees are healthcare staff. It's time to implement independent healthcare. We need to defund the punishment side of corrections and invest in healing services for prisoners. We also know that over 30% of prisoners are Indigenous. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has called this a continuation of the genocide of residential schools. There is no excuse for Canada to continue to hold Indigenous people in colonial prisons. With an annual budget of $2.5 billion, 30% of that budget, or $750 million, should be going toward Indigenous healing services, including Indigenous-run healing lodges. Our report on CSC's continued use of isolation drew attention to its overuse of lockdowns, including during the pandemic, but it seems that no amount of public shaming will prompt CSC to change its practice on its own. We're still getting calls from prisoners at Mission and Kent Institution that they're being locked down for a few days or a week because staff are testing positive for COVID. They're going 72 hours with no time at all out of their cell for a shower or a phone call, and then only 15 minutes a day after that. This is causing a lot of tension at Kent, and some Mission prisoners are saying that they're going on a hunger strike. CSC needs to be held accountable. Dr. Dube and Dr. Sprott made it clear that CSC cannot be trusted to be transparent. We need stronger external oversight with the power to make real change. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. And, you know, some of your comments really resonated with me because, again, back to the presentation with Elle Jones and Idil Abdullahi and Peter Brown and George Mayette, where they talked about meaningful human contact. One of the pieces that really came out of that talk for me was meaningful human contact is not a reasonable ask in a prison setting. And they really hit home this idea that the way that we train people to work in the prisons and the way that the system of the prison is set up, it doesn't allow for the humanity that, the natural human need to connect with one another and to care for one another is blocked in the prison context. And, and so we look at solitary confinement really as a symptom of this overall punishment model that we have, rather than looking at what are the traumas, the trauma of colonialism, the trauma of poverty, the trauma of misogyny, that lead people to becoming in prison in the first place. And why aren't we working on those with the $2.5 billion that CSC is being paid every year to continue to harm people and to continue to cause trauma, which then, starts that cycle all over again. And so I'm going to turn to Catherine Latimer, who is, really was the person who prompted us to think about putting a spotlight on solitary, and to think through, and it invited us to think through some of the opportunities with the law and some of the limitations of the law. And so I'll leave it to you now, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Emily. It was terrific, and I'm so glad that we did all collaborate to bring a spotlight on solitary confinement over the last 2 weeks. I think it is a crisis in our prison system that really needs to be addressed. I know that I learned a lot from the panelists sharing their experiences about what's happened in the prisons, and learned a great deal about what some of those potential solutions might be. And I think we're all very grateful for the many panelists and presenters who responded to our call for input, knowledge, and advice on such short notice. And I think the extent to which so many people accommodated us speaks to the frustration that many of us are feeling, that this dehumanizing practice persists under different names in our prisons. It's particularly frustrating for the John Howard Society in many ways. I think, we have 2 unanimous policy resolutions. One was to contribute to the ending of abuse of solitary confinement, and the other was to improve health services to prisoners. And just Jen will be happy to know that I think it was just this past week that we launched our charter challenge, that the substandard health care being provided to prisoners violates their charter rights. So we'll see how that goes. But it's really frustrating to have to take the federal government to court on these issues. You would think that some logic and pressure and observation of what's going on would allow for some policy changes before we had to take it to the courts. But we did take administrative segregation to the courts, and after great effort, we were quite successful, and both courts in BC and Ontario have explicitly recognized that the confinement of prisoners in isolated confinement violate their charter rights. But this continues. There's a failure to move forward to address that. And there's a failure really to appreciate that this kind of confinement is cruel and endangers the mental well-being of prisoners. So, this failure to act is simply just not acceptable. It makes a mockery of judicial decisions, which find isolated confinement of prisoners violate charter principles. It disrespects the rule of law by failing to follow governing legislation related to structured intervention units and least restrictive measures. It contravenes provisions of international human rights documents to which Canada is a signatory. It fails to deliver on the government's commitment to implement the recommendations of the Ashley Smith coroner's report that found her death to be a homicide. It disrespects the structured intervention implementation advisory panel, which was the oversight body appointed by the Minister Goodale at the time, to provide transparency and support the implementation of post-solitary regime, by refusing to provide the data and not responding to their reports. And it jeopardizes the health and well-being of far too many prisoners who are being subjected to abusive isolated confinement, whatever they choose to call it. I believe that this disregard for the law and the welfare of the state shocks the conscience of our nation. I ask all concerned Canadians to write to your members of Parliament and to sign a parliamentary petition calling for action and a judicial review. And we will be giving you the contact information so that you can participate in the petition. I ask the federal government to recognize that its commitment to end abuse of solitary confinement has not been fulfilled despite its efforts, and to launch an inquiry to find out why and to find out what kind of solutions would actually work. The abuse of Canadian prisoners in different forms of unlegislated, isolated confinement must end. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think you really brought home this idea that we're not just talking about trauma, we're talking about injustice, and we're talking about injustice that is actually illegal now. And so I also thank you for bringing up the petition, and we will put a link to the petition below this video. We're looking for as many people to sign as possible. We did circulate a change.org petition at the outset of this 2 weeks, and we have since decided, after learning so much from everyone over the last 2 weeks, that we're going to be slightly modifying that and putting it up on the government's petition format, which is slightly different from change.org. So we join all of you who have already signed our petition to sign the new one, and hopefully we'll get some others to sign as well. We know that we've had over 700 people joining us over the last 2 weeks, and we will be making all of these videos available on our YouTube channel, which is a Spotlight on Solitary and YouTube, and you'll be able to watch them and again and again and again as many times as you'd like, and use them as resources. Hopefully people will be using them in their classes, in their workplaces, and privately as well. And not only have we been hosting videos, but we have a large amount of written resources that have been produced over the last 2 weeks. And we have auditory resources as well in the form of podcasts. So we invite you to check out either on the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Society's Facebook page, the John Howard Society of Canada Facebook page, for links to those resources as well. And really, this is just, we know the beginning of our push to change. The change is going to it's not going to be rapid change, as we've had a conversation about just earlier today, but it is necessary change. And that change is necessary because we recognize prisons as being a symptom of our failing as a society to deal with societal issues that cause people to become imprisoned in the first place. And obviously not all of the organizations that we work with have the same position as CAEFS does as an abolitionist organization, but I think we can all agree that we are looking to protect the human rights of one another. And that's not happening when people are being placed in solitary. So thank you very much. I also echo everyone's thoughts and thanks, because this has been a real honor for us to work with you. Does anybody have any last thoughts, or should we end it there? Okay, I don't see, unless somebody wants to take themselves off mute. Okay. Oh yes, one more. Catherine, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank everybody. The response has been enormously gratifying on social media and traditional media, and the comments and stuff that we're hearing. Clearly, we've struck a nerve, and people are, I think, motivated to see some significant changes in this area, and we're looking forward to working with everybody who wants to see the change.
Thank you, Catherine. Adelina, did you have a last thought? Thank
you, everyone. And I'm hoping that, I know it's not true, but I'm sort of hoping this is the last time we're having this conversation. I'm an optimist at heart, even though those that have worked with me doubt it. But I am an optimist, and hopefully the conversation at least will change. And hopefully in 25 years, we won't be talking about the same thing.
Yes, thank you for that. Jen, to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I echo what everyone else has said. I think the historic perspective on this issue is really important. We all know the definition of insanity, so let's not keep doing the same thing and expect a different result.
On that note, we will end. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you.